World War II was the largest and most destructive armed conflict in human history. Between 1939 and 1945, millions of soldiers fought from the frozen forests of Europe to the deserts of North Africa, and from the islands of the Pacific to devastated cities. Yet from this enormous war emerged a small group of soldiers whose extraordinary skill, courage, and battlefield achievements turned them into legends. Snipers capable of dominating sections of the front with a single rifle, tank commanders who destroyed enemy vehicles one after another, commandos and infantrymen who carried out missions from which survival sometimes seemed almost impossible. Some achieved hundreds of confirmed or officially credited kills. Others became famous for individual battles in which they continued fighting against overwhelming enemy forces. Some received their nation's highest military decorations, but which of them were the most feared? There is no official answer to that question. No worldwide ranking was created during the Second World War measuring individual soldiers according to how much they were feared by the enemy. For that reason, the positions on this list are based on documented battlefield achievements, combat effectiveness, extraordinary actions, reputation, and the threat these men presented to their opponents. The list includes soldiers from several different nations and from very different roles. Their stories took them from frozen forests to tank battles, special operations, and some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. Each of them had a different way of surviving and fighting. And as we move closer to number 1, their achievements become increasingly extraordinary. This is the Nexus List. 10 extraordinary soldiers, 10 stories from the Second World War, and the countdown begins at number 10. Jack Churchill. Number 10, Jack Churchill, John Malcolm. Thorpe Fleming Churchill was born on September 16, 1906. He would become one of the most unconventional British commando officers of the Second World War, a man remembered by the nickname Mad Jack Churchill. Graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment in 1926. He left the regular army before the Second World War, but returned to military service after war broke out in 1939. His war began in France. When Germany attacked in the West in the spring of 1940, Churchill took part in the fighting before British forces withdrew through Dunkirk. His actions during the campaign in France resulted in the award of the Military Cross. But Churchill's story was only beginning. In 1940, Britain began creating new commando units designed to carry out dangerous raids against enemy-controlled territory. Churchill volunteered to join them. It suited his character. He became known not only for his courage, but also for the highly unconventional way in which he went to war. Churchill became strongly associated with a Scottish broadsword, or claymore, and the bagpipes. A longbow also became an inseparable part of his later legend, although not every famous wartime story involving the bow is equally well documented. In December 1941, Churchill took part in Operation Archery at Vågsøy in Norway. British commandos attacked the German-held area with the objective of destroying strategically and economically important targets. Churchill was serving as second-in-command of No. 3 Commando. During the operation, he was wounded. It did not end his career. In 1942, Churchill was appointed commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. In this position, he became one of the best-known leaders of Britain's commando forces. The war next took him to the Mediterranean. No. 2. Commando participated in operations in Sicily and later on the Italian mainland. In September 1943, Allied forces landed at Salerno, and Churchill and his men became involved in intense fighting. It was at Salerno that one of the most famous and better documented episodes of his military career took place. Churchill advanced with his runner toward the German-held village of Pigoletti, using darkness and terrain to their advantage. They moved through German positions and took enemy soldiers prisoner group by group. During the operation, Churchill and his men succeeded in capturing a substantial number of German prisoners. For his actions at Salerno, Churchill was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Churchill's style of command was aggressive. He was prepared to go personally into the places where he ordered his men to go, but the war was still far from over. During late 1943 and 1944, Churchill and No. 2 Commando operated in the Adriatic. They used the island of Vis as a base and, together with Yugoslav partisans, British commandos conducted raids against German-held islands. Churchill led operations on islands including Far and Brach. In the summer of 1944, a larger assault was planned against the island of Brach. Its purpose was to tie down German forces while German troops were putting pressure on the Yugoslav partisan movement elsewhere. Churchill led forces participating in the attack, the WWII. Fighting became extremely difficult. Churchill was wounded and captured by the Germans. According to material preserved by the Commando Veterans Archive, he played his bagpipes while awaiting the German counterattack before his capture. The Germans eventually sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany. But even captivity did not end Mad Jack. Churchill's War. Churchill attempted to escape from Sachsenhausen with another prisoner. The escape failed and he was recaptured. He was later transferred with other prominent prisoners to Austria. As the war approached its end, Churchill regained his freedom. He made his way across the Alps and eventually reached American forces in Italy. The war in Europe was effectively ending. Churchill, however, was not finished. He was sent toward Asia, where Britain was preparing to continue the war against Japan. Before Churchill could enter another campaign, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. Jack. Churchill had survived the Second World War. He continued his military career after the conflict and later served with airborne forces, his military. Decorations included the Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and later a bar to the DSO. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. Over the decades, his reputation became so extraordinary that documented history and later legend have sometimes become mixed together. But his story requires no exaggeration. He fought in France, participated in a commando raid in Norway, led men in Sicily and Italy, conducted dangerous operations in the Adriatic, was wounded more than once, became a German prisoner and attempted to escape captivity. And in the middle of all of this, he became an officer who could go into battle carrying a sword and play the bagpipes in a war zone. Jack Churchill's position on this list is not based on a massive kill count. It is based on his extraordinary combat record, aggressive style of leadership, and the reputation he built within Britain's commando forces. And that is why Mad Jack Churchill begins our countdown at number 10. Number 9. Thomas Diver Derrick. Thomas Curry. Derrick was born in Adelaide, South Australia, on March 20th, 1914. He left school at the age of 14 and worked in a variety of jobs before the war. In July 1940, he enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force and was posted to the 248th Battalion. At the time, nobody could have known that this Australian soldier would become one of his country's most famous fighting men of the Second World War. Derrick became known by the nickname Diver, and his war soon took him beyond Australia to the battlefields of North Africa. He served at Tobruk and later fought in the El Alamein area. During the fighting at Tel El Asa in July 1942, Derrick displayed such courage that he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But the war also took its toll. In October 1942, Derrick was wounded during the fighting at El Alamein and evacuated. After recovering, however, he returned to his unit. The following year, his war moved into an entirely different environment. New Guinea. The open deserts of North Africa were replaced by mountainous jungle, rain, mud, and heavily fortified Japanese positions. In late 1943, Australian forces were advancing toward Saddleburg. The elevated position was strategically important, and the Japanese had constructed powerful defensive positions in the area. The fighting was difficult. On November 21st, Derrick was placed in command of 11 Platoon B Company after it had lost many of its leaders. 3 days later, on November 24, 1943, Derrick performed the action that would make him a legend. His company was attempting to advance up a steep slope toward Saddleburg. Japanese machine guns and grenades stopped the advance. The situation began to look impossible. Daylight was fading, and the company received orders to withdraw. Derek, however, requested permission for one final attempt. Permission was granted. Then he went forward. Derek moved ahead of his men through the steep and difficult terrain. When an enemy position stopped one of his sections, he attacked it with grenades, but he did not stop there. Another section of his platoon came under intense fire from 6 Japanese positions. Once again, Derek moved ahead of his men. He climbed up the slope and hurled grenades into the enemy positions at close range. The Japanese were forced to abandon positions. The Australians gained their first real foothold on the slope. Derek continued. He returned to the rest of his men and moved forward to deal with the remaining positions. On 4 separate occasions, he rushed forward and threw grenades from only a few meters away from the enemy. By the time the action was over, Derek had personally reduced a total of 10 Japanese positions. It changed the situation. The Australians were able to hold the vital ground they had gained, and the following morning the 248th Battalion advanced into Saddleburg after the Japanese withdrew during the night. Derek was given the honor of raising the Australian flag over the captured position. For his actions on November 24, 1943, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for wartime gallantry, available to forces of the British Empire, but Derek did not regard the achievement as his alone. His own diaries reveal a soldier who valued his men and their contribution. Saddleburg made him nationally famous, but the war was not finished. Derek returned to Australia and underwent officer training. In late 1944, he graduated and received his commission. He could have continued his career elsewhere. Instead, he wanted to return to the 248th Battalion. In 1945, the unit was sent to Borneo. On May 1st, Australian forces landed on Tarakan Island as part of the Allied operations in Borneo. The Japanese had constructed strong defensive positions across the island, and the Australians once again faced difficult jungle fighting. Derek was now leading men as a lieutenant. Following fighting on May 22nd, his men dug into their positions. During the hours that followed, the situation became fatal. Derek was severely wounded by enemy fire. Despite his own serious wounds, he reportedly insisted that the other wounded men should receive treatment before him. Thomas Curry Derek died on Tarakan on May 24, 1945. He was 31 years old. His death deeply affected the soldiers who had served alongside him. Derek's military career had taken him from Tobruk and El Alamein to New Guinea and finally Borneo. He had received both the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Victoria Cross, but it is Saddleburg that explains his place on this list. When his company's advance had been stopped and the order to withdraw had already been given, Derek asked for one final chance. Then, he advanced almost alone up a precipitous slope against enemy machine gun positions. 10 enemy positions were overcome. The road to Saddleburg was opened, and Thomas Diver, Derek wrote his name into Australian military history. That is why he takes the number 9 position on our countdown. Number 8, Matt Urban. Matt Lewis Urban was born in Buffalo, New York, on August 25, 1919. During the Second World War, he became one of the United States Army's most extraordinary combat leaders. An officer who was wounded again and again, yet repeatedly returned to his men. Urban graduated from Cornell University in 1941 and entered active duty with the United States Army in July of that year. He was assigned to the 60th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division. His war did not begin in Normandy. Before France, Urban fought in North Africa and Sicily. During the fighting in North Africa, he had already demonstrated exceptional courage and received 2 silver stars for his actions. But the events that would eventually lead to America's highest military decoration began in the summer of 1944. On June 14th, Urban's company was attacking near Renouf, France. The advance came under intense German fire. Enemy tanks were firing into the American positions and inflicting heavy casualties. Urban realized that unless the tanks were stopped quickly, his company could be devastated. He picked up a bazooka. Together with an ammunition carrier, Urban worked his way through the hedgerows under continuous enemy fire toward the tanks. Then he moved into position and fired. Urban destroyed 2 enemy tanks. His actions changed the situation, allowing the Americans to continue their attack. But later that same day, Urban was wounded in the leg by fire from a 37mm tank gun. He refused evacuation. Despite his wound, he continued commanding his company until his men had established defensive positions for the night. The following morning, Urban again directed an attack. Then he was wounded again. This time his injuries were serious enough that he was evacuated to a hospital in England. For most soldiers, that would have meant a long recovery away from the front. Matt Urban did something very different. While in the hospital, he learned that his unit had suffered severe casualties. In the Normandy hedgerow fighting, Urban knew that the men needed experienced combat leaders, so he voluntarily left the hospital. He returned to France and hitchhiked his way back toward his battalion near Saint-Lô. On July 25th, he arrived at the command post of the 2nd Battalion. Operation Cobra had just begun. Urban was still limping and recovering from his wounds. Nevertheless, he went forward to find his company. When Urban reached the fighting, the American attack had again been stopped by strong German resistance. 2 supporting American tanks had been destroyed. A 3rd tank was still operational. But it was not moving and lacked a commander and gunner. Urban saw an opportunity. Getting the tank back into action was extraordinarily dangerous. 2 other soldiers were killed while attempting to mount it under enemy fire. Urban ran toward the tank himself. He climbed aboard. Completely exposed to enemy fire, he manned the machine gun and ordered the tank forward. Bullets struck around the vehicle. Urban continued firing. His actions galvanized the battalion. Americans attacked again and destroyed the enemy position that had stopped their advance. But Urban's war continued. On August 2nd, shell fragments wounded him in the chest. The battalion surgeon recommended evacuation. Urban refused again. 4 days later, on August 6th, he became commander of the 2nd Battalion. On August 15th, he was wounded again, and again he remained with his unit. Then came September 3rd, 1944. Urban's battalion was ordered to establish a crossing point over the Meuse River near here, Belgium. German forces had concentrated in the area in an attempt to stop the Allied advance. As Urban's battalion attacked toward the river, intense artillery, mortar, and small arms fire brought the advance to a halt. Urban left his command post and moved directly to the front. He reorganized the attacking troops. Then he personally led the assault. The men advanced across open ground toward the German strong point. During the attack, Urban was seriously wounded in the neck. The wound was life-threatening. Urban could speak only in a whisper, yet he refused evacuation. He remained until the enemy had been routed and his battalion had secured the crossing point on the Meuse. Only then did Urban allow himself to be taken for medical treatment. Survived, but the war left permanent marks on him. Urban ultimately received 7 Purple Hearts for wounds suffered during his wartime service. Yet his most extraordinary recognition was delayed for decades. In 1945, one of Urban's soldiers recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation, however, did not proceed normally, and the case remained unresolved for decades. Only in the late 1970s was the original recommendation rediscovered. In Urban's military records, the United States Army began reconstructing the events. Eyewitness testimony and official documents revealed an extraordinary pattern. An officer who had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire in order to lead his men. In 1980, the decision was finally made. President Jimmy Carter presented Matt Urban with the Medal of Honor on July 19, 1980. More than 3 decades after the end of the war, His actions received America's highest military recognition. Matt Urban died on March 4, 1995. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Urban's position on this list is not based on one famous battle. It is based on a series of actions across months of combat. He destroyed enemy tanks with a bazooka. He continued commanding while wounded. He walked out of a hospital and voluntarily returned to the front. Under enemy fire, he climbed onto a tank and helped restart an attack that had stalled. And finally, after receiving a life-threatening wound to the neck, he refused evacuation until his battalion had completed its mission again and again. Matt Urban demonstrated how far a combat leader could go for his soldiers and his mission. That is why Matt Urban takes the number 8 position on our countdown. Number 7. Leo Major. Leo Major was born on January 23, 1921, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to French-Canadian parents. He grew up in Montreal, and at the age of 19, he enlisted in the Canadian Army. He served with the Régiment de la Chaudière, a French-speaking Canadian infantry regiment. In 1944, his unit was sent into the campaign in Europe. Major's war truly began on one of the most famous days of the entire Second World. Warbont June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Régiment de la Chaudière landed in Normandy, at Juno Beach as part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry. Division Major served as a sniper and signaler. From the opening stages of the Normandy campaign, he demonstrated the qualities that would define his military career: a willingness to take extraordinary risks and to continue his mission in situations where many others would have been forced to withdraw. But only days after the landings, his war nearly changed permanently. A grenade explosion severely damaged Major's left eye. He effectively lost the sight in one eye. A soldier trained as a sniper was now one-eyed. Under normal circumstances, such an injury could have ended his combat service. Major refused to go home. His later famous reasoning was simple: a sniper needed only one eye to aim. Major remained at the front, and his most extraordinary actions were still ahead of him. In the autumn of 1944, Canadian forces were fighting the Battle of the Scheldt. The Allies needed access to the enormous port of Antwerp, but the Scheldt estuary remained under German control. The fighting was brutal: flooded terrain, mud, narrow roads, and strong German defensive positions made the advance extremely difficult. It was under these conditions that Major performed one of the best-known actions of his military career. During the night of October 30 to 31, 1944, he was operating alone in enemy territory. Major encountered German soldiers and eventually succeeded in taking a remarkable number of enemy troops prisoner. By the time the episode was over, he had brought 93 German prisoners back to Allied lines. One man, 93 prisoners. He was recommended for recognition for the action. But Leo Major's story continued. In February 1945, his vehicle struck a landmine. The explosion threw Major into the air. He suffered a serious back injury and was hospitalized. Once again, his war could have been over, and once again, he returned. By the spring of 1945, Allied armies were advancing through the Netherlands. The Germans were retreating, but the war was not yet finished. Cities remained under occupation, and resistance could still be fierce. One of those cities was Zwolle. In April 1945, approximately 50,000 people lived there. Canadian forces were preparing to attack the city. Before the assault, they needed information about the size of the German garrison and its defensive positions. On April 13th, Leo Major and his friend Corporal Wilfred Welly Arsenault volunteered for a dangerous night patrol. Their mission was to reconnoiter Zwolle and establish contact with the Dutch resistance. 2 men disappeared into the darkness. They would not travel far together. The Germans detected them. A firefight followed. Arsenault was killed. Major was alone. This original mission had effectively collapsed. He could have returned to Canadian lines. Instead, Major continued toward Zwolle alone. Inside the city, He decided to make the Germans believe that a major Canadian assault had already begun. Major moved through the dark streets, firing his weapons and throwing grenades at different locations. He continually changed position. The explosions and gunfire echoed. Between the buildings, one man was attempting to sound like an entire attacking force. Major also encountered German soldiers and took prisoners. He escorted captured Germans out of the city toward Allied lines and then returned to Zwolle to continue his operation. During the night, he received assistance from members of the local resistance. Major also set fire to the local Gestapo headquarters. To the German troops, it increasingly appeared that the attack on Zwolle was underway. Gradually, they began to withdraw. As morning approached, Major was able to establish something remarkable. The Germans were leaving Zwolle. The planned Canadian bombardment and larger assault were no longer required in the same way. On April 14th, Canadian troops were able to enter the city without a major battle. Zwolle was free. Leo Major did not. Of course, single-handedly win the campaign in the Netherlands, and the liberation of Zwolle cannot be separated from the larger Canadian advance. But his actions during that night were extraordinary. The courage and deception of one wounded soldier, already blind in one eye, helped prevent a major battle from taking place inside the city. For his actions in the liberation of Zwolle, Major received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. It was one of the highest British and Commonwealth awards for gallantry in the field, ranking below the Victoria Cross. The Second World War in Europe ended only weeks later. But Leo Major's military story was not finished. When the Korean War began in 1950, Major volunteered for service again. In November 1951, he led a small Canadian force during the fighting around Hill 355. His men recaptured a key position and repelled repeated counterattacks. For this action, Major received a second Distinguished Conduct Medal. He became an exceptional recipient of the DCM for actions in two different wars, but it was Zwolle that made him a legend. The city never forgot his name. Zwolle later made him an honorary citizen, named a street after him, and continues to commemorate his actions. Leo Major died on October 12, 2008, at the age of 87. Representatives from the Netherlands were among those who attended his funeral. More than 6 decades had passed since the night when a one-eyed Canadian soldier had set out with his friend on a reconnaissance mission toward Zwolle. Only one of them returned, but by morning, an entire city was being liberated. Leo Major's position on this list is not based on an enormous kill count. It is based on something, perhaps even more extraordinary. He lost the sight in one eye and continued fighting. He captured 93 Germans during the Battle of the Scheldt. He survived a landmine explosion and returned to the front again. And finally, he entered an enemy-occupied city virtually alone and convinced German forces that a larger attack was already underway. Leo Major did not need an army to make it appear that an army had already arrived. That is why Leo Major takes the number 7 position on our countdown. Number 6, Lauri Turney. Few soldiers of the Second World War continued their military careers along a path as extraordinary as the Finnish soldier Lauri Allan Turney. He fought against the Soviet Union in the Finnish army, received the Mannerheim Cross, served in Germany during the final phase of the war, and later built an entirely new military career in the United States under the name Larry Thorne. His story began in Viipuri. Lauri Allan Turney was born on May 28, 1919, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30, 1939, beginning the Winter War. Turney was already performing his military service. Finland was forced to fight against the vastly larger Soviet Union. Turney participated in the Winter War, and his military career continued after the conflict ended in March 1940. In 1941, Turney traveled to Germany to receive Waffen-SS training. His first period in Germany was relatively short, however, and he returned to Finland later that year. In June 1941, the Continuation War began. Turney again served in the Finnish army against the Soviet Union. As the war progressed, he proved himself an effective leader, particularly in reconnaissance and patrol operations. In 1943, a unit was formed around him that became known as Detachment Turney. Its missions included reconnaissance, patrolling and raids conducted under difficult conditions close to and inside enemy-controlled territory. Turney's style of leadership emphasized movement, surprise and aggressive action. He was not a commander who remained far behind the fighting. He led his men from the front detachment. Turney developed a formidable reputation within the Finnish army. One of the unit's later most famous members was Mauno Koivisto, who decades later became president of Finland. Turney's own achievements were recognized in the summer of 1944. On July 9, 1944, he was appointed Knight of the Mannerheim, Cross number 144. The Mannerheim Cross was one of Finland's most prestigious military decorations. Turney was only 25 years old. By the summer of 1944, Finland's military situation had become extremely difficult. The Soviet Union launched a massive offensive on the Karelian Isthmus, and Finnish forces fought desperately to stop the advance. Turney and his men continued operating during these battles. In September 1944, Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. The war between Finland and the Soviet Union was over, but Turney did not return to a peaceful life. In early 1945, he secretly traveled to Germany. There he received further German training and during the final weeks of the war, entered German military service. This period of his life is an essential but also controversial part of his history. As Germany collapsed, Turney surrendered to Western Allied forces. He became a prisoner of war but eventually managed to return to Finland. Back home, his difficulties continued. The Finnish state police arrested him, and his activities in Germany eventually resulted in a prison sentence for treason. President J.K. Paasikivi pardoned him in 1948. Turney's Finnish military career was effectively over, but his life as a soldier was not. In 1949, Turney escaped from Finland to Sweden. From there, his journey eventually continued across the Atlantic. After several stages, he reached the United States in 1950. There, Laurie Turney began a new life. He adopted the name Larry Thorne. In 1954, he enlisted in the United States Army. Turney was already an experienced soldier with years of knowledge in skiing, survival, reconnaissance, guerrilla operations, and combat under extreme northern conditions. The United States Army had a use for those skills. He eventually joined the Special Forces, the Green Berets. Larry Thorne had found a military environment exceptionally well-suited to his previous experience. By 1960, he had attained the rank of captain. In 1962, Thorne led an extremely demanding mission in Iran's Zagros Mountains. A United States Army aircraft had crashed high in the mountains. Previous attempts to reach the crash site had failed. Thorne led his Special Forces team up the mountain. The men reached the site at approximately 14,000 feet and succeeded in securing classified material and completing their assigned mission. But Larry Thorne's next war was already approaching. Vietnam. Thorne deployed to South Vietnam with the Special Forces. He served in the Tin Bien area, where his detachment became involved in intense fighting. Turney was wounded in Vietnam and received American decorations, including a Bronze Star for Valor and Purple Hearts. His experience in reconnaissance and unconventional warfare made him a valuable Special Forces officer. In 1965, he returned to Vietnam for a second tour. This time, his duties involved the highly secretive MAC-VSOG organization, which conducted reconnaissance and special operations in Southeast Asia. On October 18, 1965, Thorne participated in an operation in the mountainous region of South Vietnam. He was aboard a South Vietnamese Air Force CH-34 helicopter. Weather conditions were difficult. The helicopter disappeared into the mountainous jungle. Larry Thorne and 3 South Vietnamese crewmen disappeared with it. Turney was 46 years old. For decades, His exact fate and the location of the helicopter remained uncertain, but the search continued. In 1999, a search team located the helicopter's crash site. The identification of remains recovered from the site eventually allowed Thorne and the South Vietnamese crewmen to receive military burial honors. On June 26, 2003, Larry Thorne was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Laurie Turney's military career had lasted more than 2 decades and crossed 3 different armies. In Finland, he was a Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. In the United States, he became a Special Forces officer. His life also included service in Germany, a chapter that should neither be omitted nor romanticized. Turney's position on this list is based above all on his extraordinary military career. He fought against the Soviet Union in the Winter War. He commanded his own reconnaissance and combat detachment during the Continuation War. He received the Mannerheim Cross. He later started almost from nothing in a new country and rose to become a captain in the United States Army Special Forces, and finally, he disappeared during an operation over the mountains of Vietnam. 3 countries, 3 armies, a military career that began on Finland's frozen battlefields and ended in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Larry Turney, known in the United States as Larry Thorne. That is why he takes the number 6 position on our countdown. Number 5. Otto Carius. On the Eastern Front of the Second World War, tank crews fought under some of the most unforgiving conditions in the history of armored warfare. Thousands of tanks were destroyed. Entire crews could disappear within minutes. And in this environment, the German Otto Carius emerged as one of the war's best-known Tiger tank commanders. Otto Carius was born on May 27, 1922, in Zweibrücken, Germany. When the Second World War began in 1939, he was only 17 years old. Carius volunteered for military service, but was initially rejected because of his poor physical condition. He was eventually accepted into the Wehrmacht in 1940. His first major campaign took him east. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. Carius was serving with the armored forces. His first tank was not the famous Tiger, it was the Panzer 38T, a light tank of Czechoslovak origin that was widely used by the German army during the early years of the war. The Eastern Front quickly taught Carius the reality of armored warfare. Tank combat was not simply a question of who possessed the largest gun or the thickest armor. Crew training, observation, use of terrain, communication, and the ability to fire first could determine who survived. In 1943, Carius was transferred to the unit that would define his military career. Schwer Panzerabteilung 502, the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion. Its principal weapon was the Panzerkampfwagen. WWII Tiger, the Tiger I, it became one of the most famous tanks of the war. Its 88mm gun could destroy many types of enemy tanks at long range, while its heavy armor provided substantial protection. But the Tiger was not perfect. It was heavy. It consumed enormous quantities of fuel. Its transmission and other mechanical components were placed under severe strain. In difficult terrain, simply moving a vehicle weighing more than 50 tons could become a problem. The Tiger's early combat service on the Eastern Front had suffered from significant technical difficulties, but in the hands of an experienced crew, the Tiger could be an extremely dangerous opponent, and Carius learned to use it effectively. He rose to command the 2nd Company of Schwere Panzerabteilung 502 and fought in the northern sectors of the Eastern Front. Carius would later emphasize one factor above almost everything else in tank combat: the importance of the first hit. If the enemy detected you first and fired accurately, even the armor of a Tiger could not guarantee survival. Carius therefore made extensive use of terrain, reconnaissance, and surprise. By 1944, pressure from the Red Army had increased dramatically. German forces were retreating. Tiger units were frequently used as mobile reserves, rushed towards sectors where Soviet armor threatened to break through. One of the best-known actions of Carius's career took place on July 22, 1944. Around Malinava in Latvia, near Daugavpils, Soviet armored forces had advanced into the area. Carius and his men conducted reconnaissance before the attack. Then a small force of Tigers moved forward. Carius led the assault. The Tigers entered the village and surprised Soviet tanks inside. In a short and extremely violent engagement, the Germans destroyed a number of Soviet armored vehicles. The action became one of the most famous tank engagements associated with Carius, but this is precisely where documented history must be separated from the legend of the tank ace. Carius is frequently credited with destroying more than 150 enemy tanks. The exact total, however, cannot be verified with the certainty of a modern individual combat record. Armored warfare claims involved uncertainty in every army that fought the war. The same vehicle could sometimes be claimed more than once. A damaged tank might later be repaired, and separating the achievements of an individual commander from those of his entire crew and unit was not always possible. Carius's significance, therefore, does not need to rest upon one enormous number. His extensive combat experience speaks for itself. Only days after the fighting at Malinava, Carius found himself in a situation that nearly ended his life. On July 24, 1944, he was reconnoitering terrain on foot. Soviet troops surprised him. Carius came under enemy fire and was struck several times. He was extremely seriously wounded. Despite this, he survived. His wounds removed him from combat for an extended period. His service with the Tiger was effectively coming to an end, but his war was not yet over. After recovering, Carius returned to service in early 1945. Germany was then approaching military collapse. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Western Allies were entering Germany from the west. Carius received a new command. This time his vehicle was not a Tiger. He was assigned to command the 2nd Company of Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 512. The unit was equipped with Jagdtiger heavy tank destroyers. The Jagdtiger was enormous. It weighed more than 70 tons and carried a 128mm gun. On paper, it was one of the most powerful anti-tank vehicles of the war. In reality, Germany in the final phase of the conflict could not operate such machines under ideal conditions. Fuel was scarce. There was too little time to train crews. Mechanical failures were a constant problem. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Carius and his men were forced to fight the Western Allies in a situation where Germany's defeat had already become virtually inevitable. In April 1945, his unit surrendered to American forces. Otto Carius had survived the war. For his military service, he had received decorations including the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross and later the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross. After the war, his life changed completely. Carius studied pharmacy. He became a pharmacist. He established a pharmacy that he named the Tiger Apotheca, the Tiger Pharmacy. But his experiences on the Eastern Front did not disappear. In 1960, his memoir Tiger im Schlamm was published. Later becoming known in English as Tigers in the Mud, the book became one of the best-known personal accounts written by a German tank soldier about the Second World War. Carius wrote not only about tank battles, but also about leadership, trust between crewmen, and the realities of war. Otto Carius died on January 24, 2015. He was 92 years old. Nearly 74 years had passed since he had first gone to war against the Soviet Union. Otto Carius's position on this list does not depend on pretending that every tank destruction attributed to him can be proven with complete certainty. It cannot. His place is based on his status as one of the war's most experienced and best-known Tiger commanders. He fought in the Panzer 38T. He commanded Tigers on the Eastern Front. He survived severe wounds. And during the final months of the war, he returned to combat once more as a Jagdtiger commander. He was a tank commander in a war where one wrong decision could mean the death of an entire crew within seconds, and he survived. Otto Carius, one of the best-known tank commanders of the Second World War. Number 5 on our countdown. Number 4. Ivan Sidorenko. On the Eastern Front of the Second World War, a sniper could become an almost invisible threat. One shot, then silence. The enemy might know that a sniper was somewhere ahead, but not where he was hiding or when the next shot would come. In the Soviet Red Army, one man emerged as one of the best-known masters of this form of warfare, Ivan Mikhailovich Sidorenko. He was born on September 12, 1919, in the Smolensk region of Soviet Russia. Nothing in Sidorenko's youth clearly predicted his future career as a sniper. After school, he studied art in Penza, but in 1939, the direction of his life changed. Sidorenko was conscripted into the Red Army and received military training. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers were drawn into one of the largest military campaigns in history. Sidorenko was one of them. He began his war as an officer serving with a mortar unit, but during the fighting, he increasingly began using an ordinary rifle. Sidorenko quickly discovered that he was an exceptionally talented marksman. He began going on sniper missions on his own initiative. The battlefield became his school. He studied enemy movement. He learned how to select firing positions. He learned how to wait, and above all, he learned that a sniper's most important weapon was not simply his rifle, it was patience. Sidorenko's results began attracting the attention of his commanders. The Red Army did not need only one effective sniper. It needed hundreds. Sidorenko was given a new mission. He was to train others. Soldiers with good eyesight, weapons knowledge, and sufficient patience were selected as students. Sidorenko did not simply teach them how to shoot. First came theory, camouflage, reading, terrain, selecting a firing position, studying enemy behavior. Only after this preparation were his students taken on actual combat missions. Sidorenko went with them. This made his influence far greater than the personal record of a single soldier could ever have been. During the war, Sidorenko is credited with training more than 250 snipers. Each one could then become another threat to German forces. At the same time, Sidorenko's own combat record continued to grow. By 1944, Soviet award and biographical records credited him with approximately 500 enemy soldiers and officers killed with a sniper rifle. Approximately 500. That placed him among the best-known and most successful Soviet snipers of the war. But Sidorenko's activities were not limited to enemy personnel. During one mission, he used incendiary ammunition against enemy equipment. He was credited with destroying 1 tank and 3 tractors or towing vehicles. It was an unusual achievement for a sniper. Sidorenko became associated with the Soviet Mosin Nagant sniper rifle fitted with an optical sight. It was not a specialized weapon comparable to a modern precision rifle. Much of its effectiveness depended upon the man behind it. A sniper had to remain motionless. He had to control his breathing. He had to judge distance. And after firing, he often needed to change position before the enemy could locate him. The Germans, meanwhile, fielded snipers of their own. The Eastern Front sometimes became the setting for invisible duels in which 2 marksmen could hunt each other for hours or even days. Sidorenko's role as an instructor made him especially valuable in this kind of warfare. He was no longer merely a marksman. He had become an organizer of sniper operations. He later served on the staff of the 1122nd Rifle Regiment of the 334th Rifle Division. The formation served with the 4th Shock Army and later under the 1st Baltic Front. As the war continued, Sidorenko was wounded several times. Every wound could have ended his war, but he returned to service. In 1944, he was seriously wounded again. This time the consequences were greater. Sidorenko was hospitalized and did not return to normal frontline combat before the end of the war. His commanders also understood how valuable he had become as an instructor. They did not want to lose his experience. On June 4, 1944, his achievements received the highest recognition of the Soviet Union. Captain Ivan Sidorenko was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. He also received the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star Medal. The recognition reflected not only his own combat achievements, but also his importance as an organizer of the Soviet sniper movement. This is a crucial part of his story. If Sidorenko had merely been an exceptional marksman, his influence would have ended with his own shots. But by training more than 250 other snipers, he multiplied his impact. One man taught hundreds of others to operate in the same deadly way. By the end of the war, Sidorenko had reached the rank of major. He had survived the Eastern Front, but his military career did not continue far into peacetime. In 1946, he entered the reserve. After the war, his life changed completely. The man who had spent years on the front line watching the enemy through a rifle sight returned to civilian life. Among his post-war occupations, he worked at a coal mine in the Chelyabinsk region. He later moved to Dagestan. Ivan Sidorenko died in Kislyar on February 19, 1994. He was 74 years old, nearly half a century, had passed since the end of the war. But his name remained part of the history of military sniping. With Sidorenko, however, it is important to understand the nature of historical combat statistics. His record is frequently presented as exactly 500 confirmed kills, Soviet biographical and award-related. Material instead describes approximately 500 enemy personnel. For that reason, the number should not be treated like a perfectly documented modern statistical record. But the scale remains extraordinary: approximately 500 enemy soldiers, more than 250 snipers trained, multiple wounds, the title hero of the Soviet Union, and years of experience on one of the most brutal fronts of the entire Second World War. Ivan Sidorenko's danger did not come only from how accurately he could shoot. It came from his ability to teach an entire new generation of snipers to do the same. One sniper was dangerous. Hundreds trained by him were something else entirely. Ivan Sidorenko, one of the Soviet Union's best-known snipers, number 4 on our countdown. Number 3, Audie Murphy. When Audie Murphy tried to enter the United States Armed Forces during the Second World War, he did not look like a future military legend. He was small, young, and came from an impoverished farming family in Texas. Only a few years later, he would become one of the most famous soldiers in the United States Army. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20, 1924, near Kingston, Texas. His childhood was difficult. His family was poor, and Murphy began working at a young age to help support them. His mother died in 1941. After the United States entered the Second World War following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Murphy wanted to join the military. His small size became a problem. The Marines and paratroopers rejected him. Eventually, he enlisted in the United States Army in 1942. Murphy stood approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall and was extremely light. There was little about his appearance that seemed intimidating. On the battlefield, none of that mattered. After training, Murphy was sent overseas and assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division. His first real combat experience came in Sicily in 1943. His unit then fought on the Italian mainland. Murphy participated in fighting, including the campaign around Anzio. He proved himself to be an exceptionally capable infantry soldier and marksman, but at the same time, he began losing men around him with whom he had trained and fought. The war continued. In August 1944, Murphy participated in the Allied landings in southern France. It was in France that his reputation began to grow rapidly. In September 1944, he received a battlefield commission and became an officer. Murphy had risen from private to officer in only a few years. He received numerous decorations during the war, but the action that permanently placed him in American military history occurred on January 26, 1945. The location was near Holtzwihr. German forces launched a powerful counterattack against Murphy's company. The assault included 6 tanks and waves of infantry. Murphy was commanding Company B. The situation quickly became dangerous. The Germans threatened to break through the American positions and possibly encircle the company. Murphy ordered his men to withdraw into prepared positions in the woods. But he did not go with them. Murphy remained, forward, alone. He stayed at his command post and continued, directing American artillery fire by telephone against the advancing Germans. Then, an American M10 tank destroyer near his position was hit. Its crew was forced to abandon. The vehicle caught fire. Fuel and ammunition made the burning machine an extremely dangerous place to remain. It could explode at any moment. But Murphy saw something else, the tank. Destroyer's 50 caliber machine gun was still operational. He ran toward the burning vehicle, climbed onto it, and opened fire. Murphy was now completely exposed. The Germans were firing at him from 3 sides: artillery, machine guns, out small arms, and tanks. Murphy kept firing. At the same time, he continued directing artillery fire by telephone. German infantry advanced toward his position. Murphy used the heavy machine gun to break up the attack. Some German soldiers came within approximately 10 yards of him. Murphy remained where he was. The fight continued for nearly an hour. He was alone on a burning tank destroyer that could have exploded at any moment. The Germans used every available weapon in an attempt to eliminate his position. Murphy was wounded in the leg. He continued fighting. According to his official Medal of Honor citation, Murphy's machine gun fire and the artillery he directed killed or wounded approximately 50 enemy soldiers. The German infantry assault began to falter. Without infantry support, the tanks began to withdraw. Eventually, Murphy's machine gun ran out of ammunition. Only then did he leave the burning vehicle. Wounded, he returned to his men, but he refused to remain behind for medical treatment. Instead, Murphy reorganized his company for a counterattack. The Americans moved forward. Again, the Germans were forced to withdraw. Murphy's actions had helped save his company from possible encirclement and destruction. For this action, he received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. Murphy was only 20 years old. The Medal of Honor was presented to him in Europe on June 2, 1945. But Holtzwehr was far from his first recognition for bravery. During the war, Murphy received decorations including the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, Bronze Star decorations, and 3 Purple Hearts. He also received French and Belgian decorations. By the end of the war, he had risen from private to officer and had become one of the best-known soldiers in the United States. His war had taken him from Sicily through Italy and into France. United States Army Historical Material credits him with participation in 9 major campaigns and more than 240 enemy troops killed. But statistics alone do not explain Audie Murphy's story. The end of the war did not mean that the war disappeared from him. After returning home, Murphy suffered from nightmares, insomnia, and the psychological consequences of his combat experiences. At a time when the psychological wounds of soldiers were discussed far less openly than today, Murphy spoke publicly about his problems. He called for better assistance for veterans returning from war. At the same time, he began an entirely new career: Hollywood. Murphy became an actor and appeared in dozens of films. In 1955, his most famous movie was released, To Hell and Back. It was based on his own wartime memoir. Audie Murphy played himself, a real Medal of Honor recipient, portrayed his own war on the screen. The film became a major success. Murphy also continued military service with the Texas National Guard and eventually reached the rank of major. But his life ended early. On May 28, 1971, Murphy was a passenger aboard a small aircraft flying through poor weather over Virginia. The aircraft crashed into Brush Mountain near Roanoke. Everyone aboard was killed. Audie Murphy was 46 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave later became one of the cemetery's best-known sites visited by the public. There is something extraordinary about Audie Murphy's life, even by the standards of the Second World War. He was a young man whom military branches initially hesitated to accept because of his small physical size. Only a few years later, he was an officer on the battlefield. He fought in Sicily, in Italy, France. He was wounded repeatedly, and at Holtzwihr, he ordered his men to safety while remaining forward. Himself, alone on a burning tank destroyer, the Germans attacked. With 6 tanks and waves of infantry, Murphy held his position for nearly an hour, wounded, under fire from 3 directions. And when his ammunition finally ran out, he returned to his men and led them in a counterattack. Audie Murphy was not physically a large soldier, but on January 26, 1945, his actions were enormous. Audie Murphy Medal of Honor, one of the most decorated American soldiers of the Second World War, number 3 on our countdown. Number 2, Michael Wittmann. In the armored battles of the Second World War, one name became one of the best known in German wartime propaganda and later histories of tank warfare: Michael Wittmann. His reputation became associated above all with the WWII tank. The heavily armored Tiger, its powerful 88mm gun, and an experienced crew formed a dangerous combination. But in Wittmann's story, historical events, German wartime propaganda, and later legend have become intertwined. It is therefore important to separate what can be established from what was later built around his reputation. Michael Wittmann was born on April 22, 1914, in Vogeltal, Bavaria. He entered German military service during the 1930s and later joined the SS Verfügungstruppe, which became part of the Waffen-SS during the war. Wittmann therefore served in Nazi Germany's Waffen-SS. During the early stages of the war, he participated in operations including campaigns in Poland, the Balkans, and later the Soviet Union. His early armored vehicles were considerably lighter than the Tiger with which his name would eventually become associated. On the Eastern Front, Wittmann accumulated extensive combat experience. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The war in the East developed into an enormous battle of attrition. Thousands of tanks were destroyed. Crews had to learn to detect the enemy before the enemy detected them. Wittmann proved to be an effective tank commander. The decisive phase of his career began when he transitioned to the Tiger WWII. The Tiger was a formidable but demanding machine. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun could destroy many opposing tanks at considerable distances. Its heavy frontal armor provided strong protection against many Allied anti-tank weapons. But the Tiger was also extremely heavy. It consumed large quantities of fuel. Maintaining it was difficult. Mechanical failures could immobilize the vehicle without the enemy firing a single shot. The Tiger's true effectiveness depended upon its crew. The commander had to detect the enemy. The driver had to position the tank correctly. The gunner had to hit the target quickly. The loader had to keep the gun firing. The radio operator had to maintain communications. The achievements of a tank were always the achievements of an entire crew. Wittmann's successes on the Eastern Front rapidly brought him recognition. In January 1944, he received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Soon afterward, he received the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. German propaganda transformed Wittmann into one of its best-known tank soldiers. Enormous numbers of destroyed enemy. Tanks and anti-tank guns became associated with his name. Wittmann is frequently credited with a final total of 138 tanks and 132 anti-tank guns destroyed. Those numbers, however, should not be treated as a perfectly verified individual statistical record. Confirming destruction claims in Second World War tank battles was difficult. The same target could be observed by several crews. A damaged tank could be reported as destroyed, and later propaganda could simplify the achievements of an entire crew or unit by attributing them to one famous commander. Wittmann was nevertheless an extremely experienced tank commander. But the action that made his name internationally famous did not take place on the Eastern Front. It happened in Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies landed in France. Operation Overlord had begun. The Germans moved armored reserves toward Normandy in an attempt to stop the Allied advance. Wittmann served with Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101. His unit was equipped with Tiger Warn tanks. On June 13, 1944, elements of the British 7th Armored Division advanced into the area around Villers-Bocage. The British had reached a position from which they could threaten German positions. Wittmann's Tigers were nearby. He observed the British column. The situation demanded a rapid decision. Wittmann decided to attack. His Tiger moved toward the British vehicles. The next several minutes became one of the best-known individual armored attacks of the Second World War. Wittmann opened fire on the British column. Vehicles were destroyed and damaged in rapid succession. British tanks, half-tracks, transport vehicles, and other vehicles came under fire. Wittmann advanced toward Villers-Bocage. The narrow road and built-up environment created a chaotic battlefield. The Tiger's heavy armor and powerful gun were a dangerous combination against more lightly protected vehicles. But the popular story that Wittmann completely single-handedly destroyed exactly 21 or even more vehicles within minutes is too simplistic. Villers-Bocage was a larger engagement. Other German tanks and troops participated in the fighting. Historians have also debated which individual losses can definitely be attributed to Wittmann's tank. What is clear is that his initial attack inflicted significant losses and confusion on the British force. Wittmann continued into the town. There, his Tiger was eventually disabled. The crew abandoned the vehicle and managed to return to German lines. The Battle of Villers-Bocage continued without him. German propaganda quickly seized upon the action. Wittmann was presented as an example of German armored effectiveness. His photograph and name became widely known. But the battle for Normandy continued. Allied superiority increased with each passing day. In the air, the Allies possessed an enormous advantage. On the ground, more men, tanks, artillery, and supplies continued arriving. The German Tigers remained dangerous, but there were far too few of them to change the strategic direction of the war. Wittmann returned to combat. His final battle came on August 8, 1944. The Allies had launched Operation Totalize south of Condat. Canadian, British, and Polish forces were attempting to advance toward Falaise. Wittmann led Tiger tanks in a counterattack near Saint-Aignan-de-Craménil. The Tiger he was using was numbered 007. The German tanks advanced across open terrain. Allied tanks and anti-tank weapons were positioned in the area. Then Wittmann's Tiger received a fatal hit. The tank was destroyed. Michael Wittmann and his crew were killed. Wittmann was 30 years old. For decades, several competing explanations were offered for the destruction of his Tiger. British and Canadian armored units, as well as Allied aircraft, have all been proposed as responsible at different times. Modern historical analysis generally considers an air-launched rocket attack unlikely. It is more probable that Wittmann's Tiger was destroyed by Allied tank fire. However, complete certainty over which individual Allied tank fired the fatal shot has never been established. Wittmann and his crew were initially buried near the location where their tank was destroyed. Their remains were discovered in 1983. Wittmann was subsequently buried at the German military cemetery at La Combe in Normandy. His war had ended less than 2 months after D-Day. But Michael Wittmann's reputation survived. He became one of the most famous Tiger commanders in history. At the same time, a legend developed around him in which genuine combat achievements, propaganda, and post-war accounts became mixed together. His story, therefore, requires critical examination. Wittmann did not fight alone. The Tiger did not operate alone. Behind every shot was a crew. Behind every tank were maintenance personnel, reconnaissance, and an entire military organization. Wittmann also served in the Waffen-SS, part of Nazi Germany's SS organization. That historical context should not be ignored when discussing his military career. But viewed specifically through the history of armored warfare, his combat experience and his attack at Villers-Bocage made him one of the best-known tank commanders of the Second World War, the Eastern Front, the Tiger Y Villers-Bocage, Normandy. And finally, the destruction of Tiger 007 on August 8, 1944, Michael Wittmann. A soldier whose documented history is already remarkable without the exaggerations of later legend. Number 2 on our countdown. Number 1. Simo Häyhä. When discussing the most feared individual soldiers of the Second World War, the number 1 position on this list belongs to a man who did not command a tank. He did not lead a great army. He did not need heavy artillery. And he did not become famous because of dramatic speeches or wartime propaganda. His weapon was a rifle. His protection was the snow. And his greatest strength was his ability to remain unseen. Simo Häyhä. He was born on December 17, 1905, in Rautjärvi, in the Grand Duchy of Finland. Häyhä grew up in a farming family close to the border between Finland and Russia. Long before the war, hunting and shooting were important parts of his life. He joined the Finnish Civil Guard and became an active competitive marksman. Häyhä developed into an exceptionally skilled shooter years before those skills would be required in actual warfare. On November 30th, 1939, everything changed. The Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Winter War had begun. The Soviet Union possessed an enormous advantage in manpower, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Finland's defense depended partly upon smaller forces, exploiting terrain, mobility, winter conditions, and local knowledge. It was precisely this kind of war in which Häyhä's skills became extraordinarily effective. He served in the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34. His unit fought on the Kola front north of Lake Ladoga. Kola became one of the most famous battlefields of the Winter War. Soviet forces repeatedly attempted to break the Finnish positions. The Finns held. And somewhere among those snow-covered forests moved a small Finnish soldier who would become one of the most famous snipers in military history. Simo Häyhä stood only around 160 centimeters tall. In a winter forest, his small stature may even have been an advantage. He wore white snow camouflage. He knew how to move through the forest. He understood the snow, the cold, and the terrain. But above all, he knew how to wait. A sniper's work did not mean constantly firing. It could mean remaining almost completely motionless for hours. Temperatures could fall dozens of degrees below freezing. One unnecessary movement could reveal a position. One badly chosen shot could bring enemy artillery or another sniper down upon him. Häyhä prepared his firing positions carefully. He is reported to have packed down the snow in front of his rifle so that the muzzle blast would not throw loose snow into the air and reveal his location. He could also keep snow in his mouth to reduce visible condensation from his breath in the freezing air. Tiny details could determine life or death. Häyhä is particularly associated with the Finnish M28-30 rifle. The weapon was based on the Mosin Nagant system. What made his method unusual was that Häyhä generally used iron sights instead of a telescopic sight. There were practical reasons. A scope would require the shooter to raise his head higher. Its lenses could fog or freeze, and sunlight could reflect from the glass. With iron sights, Häyhä could maintain a lower profile, but this made his achievements even more remarkable. He was shooting without magnification in conditions where estimating distance, extreme cold, and visibility made every shot difficult. Häyhä's reputation grew rapidly. His shooting results were recorded in Finnish military documentation, and his activities were followed within his unit. Today, he is generally associated with more than 500 enemy soldiers shot with his rifle. The figure most frequently quoted is 505. Some Finnish sources and later studies give slightly different totals depending upon which wartime records are included. The exact figure should therefore be treated as a historical wartime statistic rather than a perfect modern database. But one thing barely changes. The scale was extraordinary. And perhaps the most remarkable factor was time. The Winter War lasted only 105 days. Häyhä's active combat period was shorter still. His reputation was not based solely upon his rifle. He also used the Suomi KP-31 submachine gun in combat. For that reason, some accounts give a total number of enemy casualties associated with Häyhä that exceeds his rifle score. But such figures require particular caution. Perfect individual verification was not always possible in the middle of a war. Häyhä's story does not require exaggeration. The documented scale is remarkable enough. Soviet troops were well aware of the threat posed by Finnish snipers. Häyhä later became internationally famous by the nickname the White Death. The name is now inseparable from his legend. However, claims that Soviet soldiers themselves widely used this exact nickname for Häyhä during the war should be treated cautiously. The origin of the name is not documented as strongly as Häyhä's own service and shooting record, but the danger presented by Finnish snipers was very real. Häyhä himself also became a target. Enemy counter-snipers attempted to locate Finnish marksmen. If a sniper's position was discovered, mortars or artillery could be directed against it. Häyhä survived for months, until March 6, 1940. The fighting at Kola continued. Häyhä was in combat when an enemy bullet struck him in the face. The wound was catastrophic. The projectile shattered his jaw and caused severe facial injuries. Häyhä lost consciousness. His comrades carried him from the battlefield. The combat career of Finland's most famous sniper was over, but his life was not. Häyhä later regained consciousness in hospital. The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940. Häyhä is reported to have regained consciousness around the time peace came into effect. He had survived, but a long recovery lay ahead. His face required extensive treatment and multiple operations. The wound left permanent damage. Häyhä did not return to comparable frontline service. His achievements, however, were recognized. He received an exceptional promotion from corporal to second lieutenant. He was awarded several Finnish military decorations, including Crosses of Liberty and Medals of Liberty. But contrary to a claim sometimes repeated online, Simo Häyhä was not a Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. The Mannerheim Cross was not established until 1941. Häyhä's legendary combat service had taken place during the Winter War. After the war, he returned to a far quieter life. He hunted. He bred dogs. He lived for many years in southeastern Finland, but his reputation continued to grow over the decades. Military historians, snipers, soldiers, and eventually an international audience became fascinated by the small Finnish farmer who had used a simple rifle during one of the coldest wars in history. Häyhä himself did not build a heroic myth around his own reputation. When he was later asked how he had become such an effective marksman, his answer became famous for its simplicity. Practice. And when asked about his wartime achievements, his attitude was similarly understated. He had done what he had been ordered to do as well as he could. No grand speeches, no self-glorification. Simo Häyhä died on April 1, 2002, in Hamina. He was 96 years old. More than 6 decades had passed since the frozen forests of Kola. The world had changed completely. But Häyhä's name had remained in history. So why does he take the #1 position on this list? Not simply because of the enormous shooting record associated with him, but because of the conditions under which it was achieved. Extreme cold, short winter days, snow-covered forests, constant enemy pressure, no thermal optics, no laser rangefinder, no modern precision rifle, usually not even a telescopic sight, only a man, a rifle, the snow, and skills developed through years of practice. Häyhä understood that a sniper's purpose was not to be seen. A perfect shot meant little if the enemy located the shooter afterward. Camouflage, patience, and knowledge of the terrain were therefore every bit as important as marksmanship itself. He could remain in position for hours, waiting, watching, and acting only when the moment was right. He was dangerous precisely because his opponent often never saw him. The first indication of his presence might be a rifle shot, and afterward the forest became silent again. Simo Häyhä was not invincible. On March 6, 1940, a bullet nearly killed him. But he survived. His active war lasted only a matter of months. Yet from those months came one of the most famous individual soldier stories of the entire Second World War. Simo Häyhä, Finnish farmer, Civil Guard marksman, Winter War soldier, sniper of Kola. A man associated with more than 500 enemy soldiers shot with his rifle. And a man who, despite suffering a devastating wound, lived for more than 60 years after the war. He did not need a Tiger tank. He did not need a machine gun to make his name famous. He needed only his rifle, the frozen forest, and the opportunity to use the skills he had practiced for years. Simo Häyhä, the White Death. Number 1 on our countdown. 10 soldiers. 10 completely different stories from one of the most destructive wars in human history. They fought in different armies, on different fronts, and in completely different roles. Among them were snipers, tank commanders, infantry soldiers, and men whose combat experiences placed them in some of the most extreme situations imaginable. Some became famous for extraordinary marksmanship, others for armored warfare. Some survived situations where the chances of survival seemed almost non-existent. But their stories share one thing: the Second World. War placed them in situations where a decision made within seconds could determine life or death. Throughout this countdown, we have traveled from number 10 all the way to number 1. We have encountered soldiers from different parts of the world and examined both their documented achievements and the legends that later developed around them. Not every wartime statistic is perfect. Not every claimed kill, destroyed vehicle, or battlefield achievement can be verified with absolute certainty more than 80 years later. That is why history must also be examined critically. Reality is often more interesting than legend. And eventually, we reached number 1, Simo Häyhä, a Finnish farmer and sniper whose name became associated with one of the most extraordinary sniper records in military history. There was no enormous war, machines surrounding him, no heavy tank, no modern technology. In the frozen forests of the Winter War, his greatest weapons were training, patience, knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to remain unseen. But this video is not the story of only one man. It is the story of 10 very different soldiers, 10 individuals caught inside a war that affected hundreds of millions of people and permanently changed the world. Their military careers can be studied and their abilities examined without forgetting the true cost of the conflict around them. The Second World War was not an adventure, was a catastrophe in which tens of millions of people lost their lives. The stories of these men represent only a tiny part of that enormous history. And now I want to hear your opinion. Which of these 10 would be number 1 on your list? Would you choose Simo Häyhä, Michael Wittmann, Audie Murphy, even Sidorenko, Otto Carius, or one of the other soldiers we have seen? And most importantly, who was missing from this countdown that you believe deserved a place? Leave your choice in the comments. If you enjoyed this documentary, leave a like and subscribe to the Nexus List. The history continues here. New battles, new personalities, new top 10 countdowns, and new stories from some of the most extraordinary events in history. Thank you for watching. This was the Nexus List. 10 Most Feared Soldiers of World War II.